The loneliest seat at the table is not the one that is empty. It is the one where everyone pretends you do not exist. I realized how true those words were the moment I stepped into my husband's childhood home that Sunday afternoon. Every year, Eleanor hosted the same family luncheon to celebrate the beginning of summer. The dining room was always filled with laughter, homemade recipes, and stories that somehow became funnier each year. I had attended these gatherings for 6 years. I knew exactly where everyone usually sat. I knew who preferred sweet tea instead of lemonade, and who always asked for extra mashed potatoes. It had always felt like a second home. At least that was what I believed until that afternoon. As I carried a homemade peach cobbler through the front door, Eleanor greeted me with a polite smile that felt strangely distant. "Hello, Olivia," she said before immediately turning to welcome another guest. She did not notice the dessert in my hands. She did not ask how I had been. I quietly placed the dish on the kitchen counter and looked around the room. My husband Ethan was helping his brother arrange folding chairs on the back patio. When our eyes met, he smiled briefly before looking away. It was not rude. It was simply different. I could not explain why, but something inside me immediately sensed that the atmosphere had changed. Family members chatted comfortably in small groups throughout the house. Conversations flowed naturally until I walked near them. Then voices became softer. Subjects suddenly changed. People smiled politely before finding reasons to step away. At first I convinced myself I was imagining things. Perhaps everyone was simply busy preparing lunch. Perhaps I was reading too much into ordinary moments. I picked up a basket of fresh dinner rolls and carried them toward the dining room. That was when I noticed the table. 11 place settings had been carefully arranged around the large oak table that had belonged to Ethan's grandparents. I counted them twice. 11 seats. 11 plates. 11 glasses. Our family had 12 people attending that afternoon. My eyes slowly searched the room again. Every chair had a folded name card resting beside the silverware. Every chair except one. There was one empty space near the far end of the table where a chair should have been, but nothing had been prepared there. I stood quietly for several seconds, wondering if another chair was still being brought from the garage. Before I could ask, Eleanor walked into the room carrying a bowl of salad. She noticed exactly where I was looking. "Oh," she said with a small smile. "We thought it might be easier if you sat at the breakfast bar today. We needed more space for everyone." I glanced toward the kitchen. The breakfast bar faced away from the dining table. Anyone sitting there would hear conversations, but would not truly be part of them. I nodded politely. "If that helps, that is fine." Eleanor thanked me before returning to the kitchen without another word. I looked at Ethan, expecting him to say something. Anything. He adjusted a stack of napkins, avoided my eyes, and quietly continued helping his brother. The silence hurt far more than any harsh words could have. During lunch, I sat alone at the breakfast bar while the rest of the family filled the dining room with conversation. I could hear laughter rising from the table. Stories moved from one person to another. Questions were asked. Memories were shared. No one asked me about work. No one mentioned the dessert I had baked that morning. No one even noticed that I had barely touched my own plate. Every now and then someone glanced in my direction before quickly returning to the conversation. I smiled whenever our eyes met because I refused to let anyone see how deeply the loneliness had settled inside me. I kept telling myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Families did not suddenly become strangers without a reason. As dessert was being served, I quietly carried empty dishes back toward the kitchen. Just as I reached the doorway, I heard someone pull out a chair behind me. Then a calm, familiar voice broke the silence that no one else had been willing to disturb. "If Olivia is eating alone," William said steadily, "then I will be joining her." The entire room fell silent before I slowly turned around to see every face at the table looking in his direction. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. William quietly picked up his dinner plate, his glass of iced tea, and the small bowl of fresh vegetables beside him. Without looking at anyone else, he walked across the room and placed everything on the breakfast bar directly in front of the empty chair beside mine. Then he sat down with the calm confidence of someone who had already made up his mind. The sound of his chair sliding across the floor seemed louder than every conversation that had filled the house only moments before. I looked at him in surprise. He smiled gently before unfolding his napkin. "No one should eat alone in a room full of family," he said softly. His words were not spoken with anger. They carried disappointment instead, and somehow that made them even more powerful. Across the room, I noticed Eleanor freeze for a brief moment while holding the serving spoon in her hand. Ethan looked down at his plate without saying anything. His brother cleared his throat awkwardly before taking another sip of water. No one challenged William, yet no one immediately joined him either. The silence stretching across the dining room felt heavier than before. William looked toward me with genuine kindness. "I have been waiting all afternoon to taste your peach cobbler," he said with a warm smile. "You always make the best one." I laughed quietly for the first time that day. "Thank you," I replied. "I hope it turned out well." "I already know it did," he answered. "You always put your heart into everything you bring." His simple compliment almost caught me off guard. It was not really about dessert. It was the first time that afternoon anyone had acknowledged that I had contributed anything at all. We ate quietly for a few minutes while conversations slowly resumed around the dining table, although they sounded noticeably less comfortable than before. Every so often I noticed someone glancing toward us before quickly looking away again. William continued asking ordinary questions about my work, the community library where I volunteered twice each month, and the flower garden I had started behind our house that spring. They were simple conversations, yet they reminded me what normal kindness felt like. Eventually, Eleanor walked over carrying the peach cobbler I had baked that morning. She placed it on the breakfast bar between us. "Would either of you like dessert?" she asked politely. William smiled. "Absolutely. Olivia spent hours making this for everyone." Eleanor hesitated almost imperceptibly before serving us generous slices. "Thank you for bringing it," she said to me. I nodded politely, although I could not ignore how different those words felt compared with the silence that had greeted me earlier. After dessert, family members began moving into the living room for coffee. I helped gather empty dishes as I always did. Nobody asked me to help, but nobody stopped me either. While I stood at the kitchen sink rinsing plates, I overheard fragments of quiet conversations drifting in from the hallway. My name surfaced more than once before voices immediately lowered. I could not hear complete sentences, only enough to know that I remained the subject people preferred discussing when I was not nearby. As I dried another plate, William stepped beside me and handed me a clean towel. "You do not have to do all of this yourself," he said. "I do not mind," I answered. "Keeping busy helps." He nodded thoughtfully. After a brief pause, he spoke again. "Sometimes people convince themselves they understand a situation without ever asking the person living through it." I stopped drying the plate for a moment. "Do you know what is happening?" I asked quietly. William did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the living room where everyone else continued talking. "I know enough to believe that you deserve better than silence," he finally said. "And I also believe that silence usually hides a story someone is afraid to tell." Before I could ask another question, Eleanor called everyone together for coffee. William gently placed the towel on the counter and walked away with the same calm expression he had carried all afternoon. His words stayed with me long after the gathering ended. On the drive home, Ethan remained unusually quiet. I waited nearly 10 minutes before asking the question that had been growing heavier inside me since lunch. "Did I do something to upset your family?" He tightened both hands around the steering wheel before answering. "It is complicated." I looked out the passenger window as familiar neighborhoods passed by beneath the golden evening sun. Complicated was not an answer. It was a way of avoiding one. And for the first time since arriving at that family luncheon, I realized that whatever had changed had not started that afternoon. It had started long before I walked through the front door. The drive home ended in complete silence. Ethan kept both hands on the steering wheel while I watched the evening light fade behind rows of familiar houses. Several times it looked as though he wanted to say something, but every attempt disappeared before a single word reached his lips. When we finally pulled into our driveway, he turned off the engine and remained seated. I waited, hoping he would continue the conversation we had barely started. Instead, he quietly said, "I never wanted today to happen like that." I looked at him carefully. "Then why did it?" He stared through the windshield for several long seconds. "I thought it would pass." His answer settled heavily between us. "What exactly would pass?" I asked. Ethan shook his head slowly. "Please trust me. Things have become more complicated than you realize." I almost smiled, not because his words comforted me, but because they repeated the same vague explanation I had already heard. Complicated. Somehow that single word had become everyone's favorite hiding place. I thanked him for driving and quietly walked into the house without saying anything else. Later that evening, I stood alone in the backyard watering the flower beds I had planted during the spring. The familiar routine usually helped me clear my thoughts, but tonight, every question returned. I replayed every moment from the family gathering. Eleanor's distant greeting, the missing chair, conversations that stopped whenever I approached, William choosing to leave the family table, Ethan refusing to explain what had changed. None of those moments felt accidental anymore. They felt connected. I simply could not see how. The following morning, I left for work earlier than usual. I worked as a librarian at the community library downtown, a place where people search for answers every day. Ironically, I spent the entire morning helping strangers find information while struggling to understand my own life. Shortly before lunch, my telephone vibrated. The caller identification displayed William's name. That surprised me. He had rarely called me directly before. I stepped outside to answer. "Good morning," he said warmly. "I hope I am not interrupting." "Not at all," I replied. "How are you?" There was a brief pause before he answered. "I have been thinking about yesterday." "So had I." "I wanted to ask if you might have time for coffee this afternoon," he continued. "There are a few things I believe you deserve to hear." My heart immediately began beating faster. "Of course," I answered without hesitation. We agreed to meet at a small cafe near the town square after work. The cafe had been serving the neighborhood for decades. Warm wooden tables, fresh pastries, and the smell of roasted coffee beans greeted customers the moment they entered. William was already waiting when I arrived. He stood to greet me with the same gentle smile he had worn the previous afternoon. After ordering coffee, we found a quiet corner away from the other customers. For a few moments, we spoke about ordinary things. The weather, the library, his vegetable garden. It almost felt like any other conversation until William slowly placed his coffee cup onto the table and looked directly at me. "Olivia," he said softly, "I need you to know something before anyone else tells you their version." I remained completely still. Several weeks ago, I began noticing that family conversations would suddenly stop whenever your name came up. At first, I assumed they were planning a surprise birthday celebration or something equally harmless. Then I realized the mood was entirely different. I listened without interrupting. "I asked Eleanor what was happening," he continued. "She told me not to worry because everything would work itself out." He sighed quietly before looking out the cafe window. That answer did not satisfy me. I leaned forward slightly. "Did she tell you why everyone has been treating me differently?" William slowly shook his head. "No. She only said that people believed certain things about you, and that it was better not to discuss them until the time was right." His words left me speechless. People believed certain things. Not facts. Not proof. Beliefs. Rumors had a way of growing stronger every time someone repeated them without asking whether they were true. William reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and carefully removed a folded note. He placed it gently on the table without opening it. "I found this by accident a few days ago," he said quietly. "I think it may explain why everyone suddenly began looking at you differently. But before you read it, I want you to promise me one thing. Do not decide what to believe until you know the entire story. Sometimes the loudest version of the truth is not the real one at all." For several moments, neither of us reached for the folded note resting between our coffee cups. I looked at it as though opening it too quickly might somehow make whatever was inside impossible to undo. William noticed my hesitation and gently nodded. "Take your time," he said. "The truth does not become less true because we wait a few more minutes." I finally unfolded the paper. It was not a letter. It was a printed copy of an electronic message. There was no signature at the bottom, only a sender's name that had already been removed before William found it. The message claimed that I had been secretly encouraging Ethan to distance himself from his parents because I wanted control over future family decisions. It also suggested that I had spoken negatively about Eleanor behind her back. I read every sentence twice before quietly placing the paper back on the table. None of it was true, not even a small part. I looked at William with disbelief. Someone actually believed this? He sighed deeply. Unfortunately, people often believe written words more quickly than spoken explanations, especially when those words seem to confirm quiet suspicions. I remained silent while replaying the previous several months in my mind. Small changes that had once seemed unimportant suddenly began fitting together. Family invitations that became less frequent. Shorter telephone conversations. Eleanor responding with polite distance instead of her usual warmth. Ethan occasionally asking unusual questions about conversations I had supposedly had but could never remember. At the time, each moment had felt isolated. Now they appeared connected by something invisible I had never seen. "Do you know who wrote it?" I asked. William slowly shook his head. "No. By the time I found the message, it had already been shared more than once. Nobody seemed interested in asking where it came from. They only discussed whether it sounded believable." His answer left me with an unexpected feeling. It was not anger. It was sadness. I had spent years trying to become part of Ethan's family. I celebrated birthdays, helped organize holiday dinners, remembered anniversaries, and supported everyone whenever I could. Yet a single anonymous message had quietly outweighed years of shared memories. William leaned forward slightly. "There is something else you should know." I looked up. "Your mother-in-law never told me she believed every word in that message. She only said she wanted to avoid unnecessary conflict until she understood more." I considered that carefully. It did not excuse the silence, but it made the situation more complicated than I had first imagined. Perhaps Eleanor had been uncertain. Perhaps she had made the mistake of remaining silent instead of asking direct questions. Either way, silence had still created distance. After finishing our coffee, William insisted on paying the bill despite my objections. As we walked toward the parking lot, he stopped beside his truck and looked at me seriously. "Promise me something," he said. "Do not confront everyone all at once. When people realize they may have been wrong, they often become defensive before they become honest. Give them room to choose honesty." I nodded slowly. "I understand." On the drive home, I kept thinking about that anonymous message. Someone had written it. Someone had shared it. More importantly, someone had decided it deserved more trust than I did. When I arrived home, Ethan was already there preparing dinner. He smiled politely when I entered the kitchen. "How was your day?" he asked. "Productive," I answered. I watched him carefully while placing my purse on the counter. "Did anyone ever tell you that I wanted to separate you from your family?" The knife he was using to slice vegetables stopped moving for just a fraction of a second. It was almost impossible to notice unless someone had been watching very closely. He slowly placed the knife down before turning toward me. "Why would you ask that?" His question answered far more than his words. I remained calm. "Because I would like to understand how people reached conclusions without ever asking me what was true." Ethan lowered his eyes. "Olivia, there are things I should have discussed with you weeks ago." I waited quietly. He took a slow breath, but did not continue. Instead, he simply said, "I think it is finally time for everyone to sit down together and have an honest conversation." As he spoke those words, I realized the silence surrounding me for so many weeks had finally begun to crack. The real question was whether the truth waiting beneath it would heal the family or reveal wounds much deeper than anyone had expected. The following evening, Ethan quietly told me that his parents had invited us back to the house the coming Saturday. This time there would be no holiday meal, no birthday, and no special occasion. Only immediate family would attend. His voice carried none of the confidence I had once associated with him. Instead, it sounded like someone hoping a difficult conversation might finally bring relief. I agreed without hesitation. I had spent too many days wondering what everyone believed. I was ready to hear it openly. During the days leading up to the meeting, life continued almost normally on the surface. I returned to work at the library each morning, greeted familiar visitors, recommended novels, and organized new arrivals on the shelves. Yet every quiet moment allowed my thoughts to return to the anonymous message William had shown me. I replayed every sentence, searching for clues hidden between the accusations. Whoever had written, it seemed to know enough about our family to sound believable, yet not enough to understand who I truly was. That realization stayed with me more than the words themselves. On Friday afternoon, William stopped by the library unexpectedly. He waited patiently until I finished helping a customer before walking over with his usual gentle smile. "I only wanted to check on you," he said. "How are you holding up?" I smiled honestly. "Better than I expected." He nodded with quiet approval. "That tells me you are focusing on the truth instead of the noise." We sat together for a few minutes near the reading area where children usually gathered for weekend story time. William looked around the peaceful room before speaking again. "There is one thing I hope you remember tomorrow. You do not need to defend your character by raising your voice. Your life has already spoken for you." His words settled my thoughts more than he probably realized. Before leaving, he gently placed his hand on my shoulder. "Let people explain themselves before you decide how to move forward." That evening, Ethan and I ate dinner together at home. Conversation remained careful but more honest than it had been in weeks. Finally, he placed his fork down and looked directly at me. I should have asked you about those accusations the day I first heard them. I listened quietly. Instead, I convinced myself that avoiding the conversation would protect everyone until things became clearer. I understand now that my silence only made everything worse. I appreciated his honesty, although it could not erase what had happened. Silence leaves people alone with assumptions, I replied gently. Assumptions rarely become kinder with time. Ethan slowly nodded. You are right. The next morning we drove to his parents' house beneath clear blue skies. The neighborhood looked exactly as it always had. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks. Neighbors watered their lawns. Nothing suggested that one family inside one familiar house was about to face weeks of unanswered questions. As we walked toward the front door, Ethan quietly reached for my hand. I accepted the gesture, not because every wound had healed, but because I believe people deserve the opportunity to choose honesty once they recognize their mistakes. Eleanor welcomed us inside with a noticeably different expression than before. Her smile looked uncertain rather than distant. She thanked me for coming and asked if I would like coffee before everyone sat down. It was a small gesture, but it felt sincere. William was already waiting in the living room. He greeted me warmly before inviting everyone to gather around the large dining table. This time 12 chairs had been arranged. Every place setting matched. Every chair carried a name card. My chair stood beside Ethan's exactly where it had always belonged. I noticed it immediately, although I said nothing. Sometimes actions reveal more than apologies. After everyone settled into their seats, Eleanor folded her hands together and looked around the table. The room became completely quiet. She took a slow breath before speaking. Before anyone says anything else today, there are mistakes that need to be acknowledged. No one interrupted her. Ethan looked toward his mother. William remained calmly attentive. I sat quietly, reminding myself of the promise I had made. Listen first, judge later. Eleanor slowly reached for a folded sheet of paper resting beside her plate. The moment I recognized it as another printed message, I understood that the conversation everyone had avoided for weeks was finally about to begin. No one moved as Eleanor slowly unfolded the printed page resting beside her plate. The only sound in the room came from the old grandfather clock in the hallway marking each passing second. She looked at the paper briefly before raising her eyes toward everyone gathered around the table. This message changed the atmosphere in our family, she said quietly. It should have started a conversation. Instead, it created silence. She placed the page in the center of the table where everyone could see it. It was the same anonymous message William had shown me at the cafe. Seeing it again no longer surprised me. What mattered now was hearing how everyone had allowed it to influence their actions. Eleanor took a slow breath. When I first received this message, I did not know whether it was true or false. I told myself I needed time before asking questions. Looking back, I realized that waiting became its own decision. Her voice trembled slightly before becoming steady again. Instead of speaking directly with Olivia, I became distant. I believed I was avoiding conflict, but I was actually creating it. The room remained completely silent. Ethan lowered his eyes while his brother quietly folded his hands together. William listened without interrupting. Eleanor continued. I also shared the message with a few family members because I wanted their opinions. I thought I was asking for advice. Instead, I allowed assumptions to spread before the truth ever had a chance. Her words settled heavily across the table. Nobody looked comfortable. I realized that every person present had probably carried a different version of the same misunderstanding. William finally spoke. Rumors grow strongest when nobody asks the person they are about. Eleanor nodded slowly. You were right from the beginning. She turned toward me with sincere regret in her expression. Olivia, I should have invited you into that conversation the very first day. I am deeply sorry that I did not. I appreciated her honesty, yet I remained quiet. I wanted everyone to finish speaking before I responded. Ethan finally looked at me. I made the same mistake, he admitted. I wanted to believe you, but I also believed that waiting for everything to become clearer would somehow protect our family. Instead, I left you completely alone while everyone formed opinions around you. He paused before continuing. You deserve questions. I gave you silence. His words sounded genuine. and for the first time in weeks I believed he fully understood what had hurt me most. William gently leaned back in his chair before asking the question that seemed to matter more than anything else. Has anyone actually found evidence proving the message was true? The room became still once again. One by one, family members quietly shook their heads. No documents. No conversations. No witnesses. Nothing beyond anonymous accusations repeated often enough to sound believable. William looked around the table before speaking calmly. Then every relationship in this room was changed by assumptions rather than facts. No one argued because no one could. Eleanor slowly reached into a folder beside her chair and removed another sheet of paper. Yesterday, I asked our internet service provider to help trace where the original message entered my email account. She handed the printed report to William, who carefully read it before passing it toward Ethan. The report did not identify a specific person, but it confirmed something important. The message had not come from anyone inside our immediate family. It had originated from an anonymous account created only a few days before it was sent and deleted immediately afterward. Ethan quietly looked up. So we never even knew who started this. Eleanor slowly shook her head. No, we only knew that we allowed it to divide us. I finally spoke for the first time since everyone had gathered. The message may have started the misunderstanding, but it did not create the silence. We all did that together. Nobody objected. The truth sounded surprisingly simple once it was spoken aloud. Eleanor gently folded her hands together again. There is still one question we need to answer, she said softly. Now that we understand how this happened, what kind of family do we choose to become from this moment forward? Every face around the table turned toward me, waiting for an answer that I had not yet decided whether I was ready to give. No one spoke after Eleanor asked what kind of family we wanted to become. The silence no longer felt cold or uncomfortable. It felt thoughtful. For the first time since I had walked into that house weeks earlier, everyone seemed willing to sit with difficult truths instead of escaping from them. I looked around the table before answering. Every face reflected something different. Regret, uncertainty, embarrassment, hope. I took a slow breath before speaking. I cannot pretend the past several weeks did not happen, I said calmly. There were moments when I questioned myself because nobody would tell me what was wrong. I searched for mistakes that did not exist simply because. Silence made me believe I must have done something. No one interrupted. Eleanor lowered her eyes while Ethan listened without moving. The hardest part was never the anonymous message, I continued. The hardest part was discovering that people I loved chose assumptions before conversation. Ethan quietly nodded. You are right. William remained silent, allowing everyone else to absorb each word. I looked toward Eleanor. I understand that receiving a message like that would create questions. I probably would have had questions too. But questions should bring people together, not push them apart. Eleanor slowly reached across the table and rested both hands in front of her. I understand that now, she said softly. I convinced myself I was protecting the family by waiting. Instead, I created distance where trust should have existed. Her voice carried genuine regret rather than excuses. That difference mattered. Ethan finally spoke again. I would like to tell everyone something I have not admitted before. Every person at the table turned toward him. He took a slow breath before continuing. When I first saw that message, I did not believe it completely. But I also did not reject it completely. I allowed uncertainty to become an excuse for avoiding a difficult conversation with my own wife. He looked directly at me. I thought I needed more time. The truth is that I lacked courage. His honesty filled the room with another long silence. William gently smiled. Admitting a mistake is often the first real act of rebuilding trust. Ethan nodded appreciatively. Eleanor looked around the table before speaking once more. There is something I would like everyone here to promise. Her voice sounded stronger than before. If any of us ever hears something serious about another member of this family again, we will speak directly to that person before believing it, repeating it, or allowing it to influence our relationships. One by one, everyone quietly agreed. There were no dramatic speeches, only simple promises that somehow felt more meaningful because they were spoken without pressure. I reached into my handbag and carefully removed the folded anonymous message William had given me at the cafe. I placed it beside the identical copy already resting on the table. These papers controlled our family for weeks, I said quietly. Not because they contained the truth, but because we allowed them to replace honest conversation. William picked up both copies and looked at them thoughtfully. Then perhaps they have served their final purpose, he replied. He folded the papers neatly and placed them inside an envelope marked with only one handwritten word. Lesson. No one objected. We did not need to destroy the pages. We needed to remember what happened because forgetting would make repeating the same mistake easier. As the meeting slowly came to an end, something unexpected happened. Eleanor stood, walked around the table, and gently placed a hand on my shoulder. There is one more thing I need to correct, she said. She looked toward the dining room, where 12 chairs remained neatly arranged exactly as they should have been from the beginning. The next family dinner will not be remembered for where anyone sat. It will be remembered because nobody will ever sit alone again. I smiled quietly, appreciating both the words and the sincerity behind them. As Ethan and I prepared to leave, William walked us to the front door. Before opening it, he looked at me with the same calm expression he had shown at the breakfast bar weeks earlier. Truth rarely arrives with loud voices, he said. More often, it begins with one person willing to ask one honest question. As we stepped outside into the warm afternoon sunlight, I realized that the misunderstanding had finally ended. What remained was not the memory of being excluded. It was the opportunity every person in that family now had to choose trust over assumption, beginning with the very next conversation. The weeks that followed felt different in ways I had not expected. Nothing changed overnight, yet small moments slowly replaced the distance that had settled over our family. Eleanor began calling me simply to ask how my week had been instead of waiting for holidays or special occasions. Ethan no longer avoided difficult conversations. Whenever uncertainty appeared, he addressed it immediately instead of allowing silence to fill the space between us. William continued doing what he had always done best. He quietly reminded everyone through his actions that kindness often carried more influence than the loudest opinions. One Saturday morning, Eleanor invited me to join her at the local farmers market, a tradition she had enjoyed for years with different members of the family. At first, I wondered whether accepting the invitation might feel uncomfortable, but something inside me said that rebuilding trust required accepting genuine efforts as well as offering them. The market was busy with families buying fresh vegetables, homemade bread, flowers, and local honey. We walked slowly from one stand to another, speaking about ordinary things that had nothing to do with misunderstandings or anonymous messages. For the first time in weeks, our conversation felt natural again. As we stopped beside a flower stand, Eleanor picked up a small pot of white daisies and smiled gently. "These always remind me of fresh starts," she said. I smiled back. "They remind me that healthy things grow slowly." She looked at me thoughtfully before nodding. "That is true for relationships as well." We purchased the flowers together before continuing through the market. Later that afternoon, she invited me into her kitchen to help prepare dinner for the family gathering scheduled the following weekend. It was the same kitchen where I had once stood alone washing dishes while wondering why everyone seemed so distant. This time the atmosphere felt completely different. We chopped vegetables together, laughed about old family recipes, and even disagreed over the best way to season homemade soup before laughing again. Nothing about the afternoon felt forced. It simply felt honest. While placing fresh bread into the oven, Eleanor quietly said, "There is something I have wanted to tell you." I looked toward her. She rested both hands on the kitchen counter before continuing. "When I first became a mother, my greatest fear was making a decision that would hurt my family. Ironically, that fear became the reason I hurt everyone." I remained silent, allowing her to continue. "I believe protecting people sometimes meant delaying difficult conversations. Now I understand that honest conversations are often the greatest protection we can give each other." Her words carried quiet wisdom earned through experience rather than pride. I gently touched her hand. "We all learned something we needed to learn." She smiled gratefully. The following Sunday, the family gathered once again around the same dining table where everything had begun. As I entered the dining room, I immediately noticed that my place had been carefully prepared beside Ethan exactly as it had been before the misunderstanding. The simple sight of that chair reminded me how powerful ordinary gestures could become when they reflected genuine respect. William looked around the table with quiet satisfaction before raising his glass of iced tea. "Before we begin," he said warmly, "I would like to make one small observation." Everyone looked toward him. Several weeks ago, we almost allowed one anonymous voice to become louder than years of shared memories. Today, we are choosing something better. Nobody hurried to speak after that because nothing more needed to be added. The truth had already been acknowledged. Trust had begun, returning one conversation at a time. During dinner, laughter gradually replaced hesitation. Stories moved naturally around the table. People asked about my work at the library. Eleanor proudly served the peach cobbler recipe we had prepared together that morning, insisting everyone take a second helping. Ethan smiled more freely than I had seen in months. As I looked around the room, I realized that forgiveness had never required pretending painful moments had not happened. It simply required deciding that those moments would no longer define the future. Before everyone left that evening, Eleanor quietly handed me the small pot of white daisies we had purchased together at the market. "These belong with you now," she said. I accepted them with a grateful smile, realizing that the flowers were no longer simply a gift. They had become a quiet reminder that trust, once damaged, could still bloom again when people chose honesty, patience, and the courage to speak before silence had another opportunity to divide the people they loved. Several months passed, and life gradually settled into a rhythm that felt peaceful again. The memory of those difficult weeks never completely disappeared, but it no longer carried the weight it once had. Instead, it became a quiet reminder of how easily trust could be weakened when people stopped talking to one another. The white daisies Eleanor had given me at the end of our family dinner now rested on the kitchen windowsill. They had grown taller, producing fresh blooms that greeted me every morning while I prepared coffee before leaving for the library. Each time I watered them, I remembered something William had said. Healthy things grow slowly. The same was true for trust. One Sunday afternoon, almost exactly 1 year after the family luncheon where I had been asked to sit alone, Eleanor invited everyone together once again. This gathering felt different before it even began. As Ethan and I walked toward the front porch, laughter drifted through the open windows. Children played in the backyard. Familiar voices welcomed neighbors arriving with homemade dishes. The atmosphere no longer felt careful. It felt comfortable. When Eleanor opened the front door, she greeted me with a warm embrace. "I am so happy you are here," she said with complete sincerity. There was no hesitation in her voice, no uncertainty in her expression. Inside the dining room, the large oak table had been set exactly as it always should have been. 12 matching place settings surrounded the table, and every chair stood ready before anyone arrived. I noticed something that made me smile. Beside every plate rested a small handwritten card with each family member's name. Mine sat beside Ethan's in the center of the table. There was no empty space, no missing chair, no breakfast bar waiting in another room. William caught my eye from across the table and smiled quietly. Neither of us needed to say anything. We both understood what that single chair represented. During dinner, conversations flowed naturally from one end of the table to the other. Eleanor asked about new reading programs at the library. Ethan proudly shared news about a community project his office had completed. William joked about his vegetable garden producing more tomatoes than he knew what to do with, earning laughter from everyone around the table. The warmth in the room felt genuine because it had been rebuilt rather than assumed. After dessert, Eleanor gently tapped her glass with a spoon. The room gradually became quiet. She stood with a small smile before looking around the table. "Last year," she began softly, "I learned one of the most important lessons of my life. Families are not protected by avoiding uncomfortable conversations. Families are protected by having them with honesty and respect." She turned toward me. "Thank you for giving us the opportunity to become better instead of simply walking away." I felt every pair of eyes turn toward me, but this time I did not feel isolated. I felt included. I smiled gently before answering. "We all chose to learn together. That is what made the difference." William slowly raised his glass of iced tea. "Then let us make one promise that never changes," he said warmly. "Whenever questions appear, we will ask each other before believing anyone else." One by one, every family member quietly agreed. It was a simple promise, yet everyone understood its value because they had experienced the cost of forgetting it. As the evening came to an end, I helped Eleanor carry empty dishes into the kitchen just as I had done many times before. She looked at me with a grateful smile. "Do you remember the day you stood here washing dishes by yourself?" she asked quietly. I nodded. "I remember." She gently shook her head. I hope you never feel alone in this house again. I placed the last plate into the dishwasher before looking toward the dining room, where the family continued laughing together. I do not, I answered honestly. As Ethan and I drove home beneath a sky filled with stars, I realized that the most meaningful person in our story had never been the one who started an anonymous rumor. It had been the one person who refused to remain silent when everyone else did. William did not solve every problem himself. He simply chose compassion before assumption, courage before comfort, and truth before convenience. Sometimes a family does not need a hero who speaks the loudest. Sometimes it only needs one person willing to pull out a chair, sit beside someone who has been forgotten, and remind everyone else what love is supposed to look like.